The road to Briar Hollow was narrow and cruel, winding through skeletal trees that seemed to lean inward, whispering in a tongue the wind had long since forgotten. By the time Lydia Crane reached the outskirts of the forgotten hamlet, dusk had devoured the sky, leaving behind only a bruised smear of light and the hum of cicadas dying in the cold. Her headlights struck the crooked sign, Blackwell Estate, Private Grounds, its letters carved too deep, as though someone had wanted the warning to last forever. The road that led Lydia Crane to Briar Hollow felt less like a path through the countryside and more like a descent into some place time had surrendered. She had followed the cracked, moss-eaten map with a scholar's patience and a pilgrim's curiosity, tracing each faint marking that promised to lead her to the heart of the Blackwell mystery. For months, she had studied the whispers of this family, merchants turned aristocrats, their name once uttered with reverence, later with disgust, and finally, with a silence heavy enough to be its own kind of curse. The Blackwells had vanished from every official record after 1894. Births, deaths, property transfers, all gone. It was as though the family and their mansion had been methodically erased, not by bureaucracy or neglect, but by intention. That absence was what drew Lydia more than anything else. She had built her reputation as a historian on finding what history wanted forgotten, and the Blackwells, she suspected, were her greatest discovery yet. The drive itself became an initiation. As she left the last gas station 40 miles back, civilization seemed to peel away mile by mile. The radio crackled into static, and her phone lost signal long before the sun had fallen behind the ridge. The asphalt gave way to dirt, the dirt to gravel, the gravel to something pale and dry, the color of old bone. The trees pressed closer the further she went, their branches like fingers interlocking above the road, sealing her in. The air changed, too, becoming heavier, as though saturated with memory. Even the wind moved differently, not rushing or sighing, but whispering, its tone uncertain, searching. Lydia caught herself glancing into the mirror too often, half expecting to see someone in the back seat, though she was alone. When the sign appeared through the mist, *Blackwell Estate, Private Grounds*, it startled her. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was there at all. The signpost leaned at an unnatural angle, as though something beneath the soil had tried to drag it under. The letters weren't painted but carved deep into the wood, gouged by a hand that had meant to make them permanent. She ran her fingers along the grooves and found them damp with rot, the wood pulsing faintly as though breathing. The air around her seemed to hum. Somewhere beyond the veil of trees, a low sound rolled through the hollow, not thunder, but something slower, like the groan of a great door turning on its hinges. Lydia had expected ruin, but not resistance. The Blackwell Estate did not look abandoned so much as *defiant star. It loomed at the end of the gravel road, half consumed by ivy, its facade leaning like an old man refusing to bow. The roof sagged, yet the chimneys still stood tall, their soot-stained mouths open against the sky. The windows reflected nothing. They seemed to drink in the light from her car's headlights instead, as if the house itself were tasting her arrival. She cut the engine, and silence swallowed the world in an instant. The only sound left was the slow tick of cooling metal and the distant, rhythmic pulse of cicadas, or something that only wanted to sound like them. As she stepped out, the temperature dropped. A faint fog rolled low along the ground, twisting around her ankles as she walked toward the house. The gravel under her shoes sounded unnaturally loud, and with each crunch, she imagined the sound traveling down into the earth, waking something beneath. She paused at the bottom of the front steps. They were carved from pale stone, slick with moss, each one etched faintly with initials and dates. Some of them were carved so deeply that the edges bled into the next. Births. Deaths. The same few names repeating over generations: Thomas, Eleanor, Samuel, Miriam, and one that appeared again and again, carved differently each time. *Anora. Lydia traced it with her gloved hand, and a chill crawled up her arm. She turned, half expecting to see lights from the town somewhere in the distance, but Briar Hollow had already vanished behind her, consumed by the mist. The forest had drawn close, erasing the road completely. There was no sign of movement, no wind through the branches, no rustle of animals, nothing that felt alive. Only the house. It waited with the stillness of something listening. Lydia forced herself to continue, her breath visible in the chill. The door stood slightly ajar, the gap just wide enough to reveal darkness inside, not empty, but thick, as though it had weight. A strip of torn velvet hung from one handle, blackened with age, its edge burned as if seared by a candle flame. She felt the air shift as she stepped closer, the faint scent of iron and rain rising from within. Somewhere beyond the threshold, something tapped faintly, rhythmic and deliberate, the sound of a pendulum, or perhaps a heartbeat muffled by walls. For the first time, Lydia hesitated. Her training told her the unease was irrational, that old places carried echoes, that a historian's mind was always vulnerable to the power of suggestion. But another part of her, the quiet instinct that had guided her through forgotten crypts and decaying archives, whispered otherwise. There was something here that * remembered star. She reached for her notebook, scribbling the date, the time, and her first impression, * the estate exists. The records are wrong. *, but as she lifted her pen from the paper, she noticed the ink smearing, not wet, but trembling, the words seeming to pulse faintly as if alive on the page. She closed the notebook and looked up. The house seemed to breathe with her. Every inhalation she took was mirrored by the faint creak of old timber, every exhalation by the whisper of wind through unseen cracks. Somewhere deep inside, a light flickered, weak, golden, like the last gasp of a candle in a sealed room. Lydia told herself it must be the reflection of her headlights on glass. Yet when she turned, her car was already dark, its lights extinguished, though she hadn't touched the switch. She stood at the door of the Blackwell estate, her pulse steady but her hands trembling, her breath clouding in the damp night air. The fog rose higher now, curling along the veranda, blurring the line between ground and sky. The road that had brought her here had vanished, swallowed whole by the mist. There was no way back, only the waiting dark beyond the open doors, and the weight of a history that did not want to be found. The first night in Briar Hollow settled over Lydia like a shroud. After spending hours exploring the lower floors of the Blackwell mansion, she returned to the small room she had chosen for herself, a corner chamber with peeling wallpaper and a cracked window that overlooked the dying woods. She lit a single oil lamp, its flame bending in the still air, and wrote by hand what she had found so far: no personal effects, no recent signs of life, and yet an unnatural sense of habitation in every corridor. The air had weight, and she could feel it pressing against her as though the house itself were breathing. But the strangest thing of all was not inside the mansion. It began just as night fell, when the fog rolled in from the hollows beyond the ridge and the voices began. At first, she thought it was the wind. The sound rose softly from the trees below the estate, faint as a hum, like a hymn half-sung through water. The melody drifted upward, carried by the fog that thickened with the coming dark, and though she could not make out words, the rhythm was deliberate. It pulsed like something alive. Lydia stepped to the cracked window and pushed it open just enough for the sound to enter. It wasn't wind, not quite. The notes moved in strange patterns, some high and lilting, others deep and drawn out, like voices calling from beneath the earth. For a moment she imagined a choir, hundreds of people singing in unison, but the sound didn't echo like human song. It was closer, sharper, vibrating against her ribs as if it were resonating from within the walls. The locals had warned her, though their warnings had been wrapped in the kind of folklore scholars were trained to dismiss. Earlier that day, when she had stopped at the general store before heading up the old road, the man behind the counter had looked at her papers, her maps, and her polite confidence, and said only, "Don't linger when the fog sings." Another woman, old and hunched, had added, "That's when the Blackwells remember their own." Lydia had written it off as superstition, a remnant of rural ghost tales meant to keep children from wandering too far at night. But now, standing at the window with the fog rising like smoke through the trees, she realized there was nothing whimsical about it. That singing fog, as the villagers called it, had texture, density, and intention. It did not fill the air at random, it moved with purpose, curling and twisting around the estate's edge like a living thing that knew its boundaries. She listened for hours, entranced and uneasy. The voices would rise, cresting into a strange harmony, and then dip into silence so complete that her heartbeat became unbearably loud. Then, without warning, they would begin again, closer this time, as though circling her room. She told herself it must be the acoustics of the hollow, the way sound carried through wet air and tangled trees, but there was a rhythm to it that defied nature. Every few minutes, the melody would fracture, and she could swear she heard a single word break through the murmur, soft, drawn out, and almost tender. It was her name. The first time she heard it, she froze. The second time, she closed the window, heart hammering, telling herself that exhaustion and isolation were playing tricks on her mind. But when the lamp flickered and dimmed, and the fog outside glowed faintly as if lit from within, she began to wonder whether she had already stepped too far into something she did not understand. Sleep refused to come. The walls seemed to breathe with the sound, expanding and contracting in sync with the fog's low hum. Around midnight, she left the room and made her way down the hall, her lantern's flame shivering as she moved. The portraits along the corridor watched her with that same fixed awareness she had noticed earlier, the painted eyes glinting faintly in the light, as though the varnish itself were wet. The song outside shifted tone as she walked. It no longer felt like a chorus but like a gathering, dozens of voices humming in unison, circling the estate. And then, beneath the sound, something else began, the faintest whisper, so close it seemed to come from behind her ear. She turned sharply, the lantern jerking in her hand, but the hall was empty. The whisper came again, clearer this time, threaded through the rhythm of the fog, a child's voice, melodic and wrong in the way only a memory can be wrong. It said her name once, slowly, stretching each syllable, before fading into laughter. Lydia pressed her back against the wall, her breath shallow, the cold from the plaster seeping through her coat. The laughter was replaced by a sound like footsteps moving across gravel, though the floor beneath her was wooden and still. She listened, counting her heartbeats until the noises stopped. She did not sleep that night, nor the next. Each dusk brought the same thick fog creeping up from the hollow, and with it, the same spectral chorus. By the third night, she began to discern more than melody, the suggestion of language buried beneath the hum. She thought she heard fragments of Latin prayers, Old English psalms, and something far older still, the syllables heavy and uneven, spoken as though underwater. The song shifted depending on where she stood in the house. In some rooms it was faint, mournful, almost gentle, while in others it was sharp enough to rattle the window panes. Lydia began to record the sounds in her notebook, not as words but as impressions, asterisk low, feminine, near chapel wall, repeated twice star. She noticed that the fog never entered the estate completely, it circled the grounds, hugging the tree line, as if held back by an invisible boundary. And yet, every morning when it finally lifted, she found wet footprints on the veranda, too small to belong to an adult, leading from the outer edge of the fog straight to the front door. Her rational mind tried to construct an explanation. Temperature shifts, sound refraction, auditory hallucination brought on by isolation, but none of those theories accounted for the whisper that came from inside her room at dawn, when the fog had already thinned and the world was waking. She had been sitting at her desk, reviewing her notes, when the faint, childlike voice spoke again, not from outside this time, but from the corner of her room, where the lamplight didn't quite reach. It said the same word 3 times, each slower than the last. It said her name, and then, almost softly, it said, "Welcome home." By the 4th evening, the mansion had begun to shift around Lydia in ways she could no longer dismiss as tricks of the mind. The fog continued to sing each night, and though it no longer startled her, its presence had begun to feel intrusive, as if it were learning the cadence of her breathing. Sleep had become impossible, and so she wandered, lantern in hand, notebook tucked under her arm, exploring the upper levels of the Blackwell estate, where the air grew colder and the walls seemed to lean closer together. She had discovered a pattern in the house's construction: corridors that appeared to double back on themselves, staircases that ended in blank walls, and rooms with doors that wouldn't open one night and would creak ajar the next. It was during one such restless circuit that she stumbled upon the door to the sealed chamber. It was hidden behind an ornate tapestry on the 3rd floor, the fabric brittle with dust and age, depicting a family banquet. The Blackwells gathered around a table laid with food long since turned to shadow. The eyes of each figure seemed to follow her as she lifted the edge of the tapestry, revealing a narrow, iron-handled door embedded in the wall. There was no lock, but the handle was cold enough to burn her skin when she touched it. It resisted at first, then gave way with a low groan that echoed down the hall like a sigh. The door swung inward, releasing a gust of air so still and heavy it seemed to have been waiting centuries for release. The lantern's light barely pierced the dark. Inside was a long, rectangular chamber lined with tall, ornate mirrors. Each one was draped in a black cloth that reached the floor, their corners stiff with time. The air smelled faintly of silver polish and decay, and the temperature dropped so sharply that her breath turned white. She hesitated on the threshold, heart thudding. The arrangement of the mirrors felt deliberate, like sentinels or mourners standing guard over something unseen. The floorboards beneath her feet were warped and soft with moisture, creaking with each careful step. She counted 11 mirrors in total, each identical in height and frame, baroque, gilded, the designs etched with winged figures and vines that twisted around skulls and flowers. It was a strange blend of beauty and mourning, artistry wrapped around unease. The mirrors faced one another in a formation that allowed for infinite reflections if the cloths were removed. Lydia noted this immediately, her mind cataloguing the symmetry, the ritualistic placement. She wondered if this was a ballroom once, or perhaps a family memorial room, and then dismissed the thought. There was no trace of grandeur here. Only containment. Her fingers brushed one of the cloths, and she felt the static of cold air prick her skin. The cloth shifted slightly, revealing a sliver of glass beneath. For a moment, she caught a flicker of movement, her own lantern light trembling across the mirrored surface. But the reflection did not align with her motion. The lantern tilted in her hand. In the mirror, it remained perfectly still. Lydia froze. Her pulse roared in her ears, and she pulled the cloth back entirely before she could think to stop herself. The uncovered mirror reflected the room, but not as it was. The chamber within the glass was brighter, cleaner, untouched by decay. The black cloths on the other mirrors were still there, yet they hung differently, as if stirred by a breeze that did not exist in her world. She leaned closer, bringing the lantern up to her face, studying the glass. Her reflection looked back, pale, drawn, sleepless, but as she watched, something in the reflection's eye shifted. It blinked a moment too late. Then, slowly, deliberately, it smiled. Lydia stumbled backward, the lantern swinging wildly and throwing shadows across the ceiling. For one disorienting instant, every mirror in the room seemed to ripple beneath its covering, as though something inside had moved. The air turned dense, vibrating faintly with the low hum she'd first mistaken for the fog song outside. It was here now, inside the house, echoing off the walls. She tried to steady herself, rationalizing the impossible, the air currents, the tricks of the light, the exhaustion. But when she looked again, her reflection still stood there in the mirror, frozen in place, the faint smile now gone, eyes locked onto hers. And behind it, in that alternate version of the chamber, she could swear she saw the faint outline of a figure standing in the far corner, its shape obscured but unmistakably human. She moved closer again, compelled by the instinct of both curiosity and dread. The figure didn't move, yet its presence distorted the air within the reflection. The glass pulsed faintly, as though the barrier between the two spaces was thinner than it should be. She reached out with her gloved hand, hovering an inch from the surface. The cold radiating from the glass was unbearable. When she finally touched it, a sound like static crackled through the room, sharp and electric. Her reflection flickered, and for one heartbeat, she was staring not into a mirror but through it, into a room that was exactly like hers, only wrong. The colors too vivid, the shadows too deep, the figure in the corner a step closer than before. Then the light in her lantern sputtered out. The darkness that followed was absolute. She could still feel the mirror's cold surface against her hand, but it was no longer smooth. The glass beneath her fingertips felt uneven, like skin pulled taut over bone. She yanked her hand back and stumbled toward the door, nearly tripping over the warped boards. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she fumbled for the latch. When she finally wrenched the door open, the corridor beyond was flooded with dim grey light from her still-burning lantern, though she was certain it had gone out only moments before. She slammed the door behind her and pressed her back against it, her heart pounding, her palm stinging where it had touched the glass. When she looked down, she saw a faint outline on her skin, like frost or burn marks, the shape of a handprint, smaller than hers. The mirrors behind the door were silent again, the hum fading as though nothing had ever stirred within. But even as she stood there, trying to steady her breath, she felt the distinct sensation that she was no longer alone in the hall. The portraits lining the wall seemed to have shifted in their frames, their gazes now angled slightly toward her, as if waiting for her to uncover the next cloth. The discovery of the mirror chamber had changed something fundamental in Lydia's understanding of the Blackwell estate. It was no longer merely a decaying relic of Southern wealth or a curiosity for the pages of an academic journal, it was a living system, pulsing with memory. Over the days that followed, she noticed small shifts that unsettled her in ways she could not explain. Doors she had closed stood open in the morning. The clock in the foyer, whose pendulum had been frozen for decades, began to tick again, slow and arrhythmic. At night, when she sat by the oil lamp transcribing her notes, she could hear faint murmurs traveling through the walls, the same strange cadence she had once attributed to the fog. They were clearer now, threading together syllables she could almost translate. Somewhere between fascination and fear, Lydia knew she was on the edge of uncovering the truth that had buried the Blackwell family's name. In the house's library, a vast, dust-choked room lined with volumes that seemed to dissolve when touched, she found the first concrete clue. A collection of journals, bound in cracked leather and tucked behind false shelving, written by Eleanor Blackwell, the matriarch of the family during the late 1800s. The handwriting was elegant but fevered, the ink dark and pressed deep into the pages as if written in haste. Most of the entries were mundane at first, accounts of weather, illness, guests, until the tone shifted sharply midway through one volume. The later entries read less like diary notes and more like confessions. Lydia read for hours beneath the dim light, the words trembling in her hands as she began to understand what had truly been practiced within these walls. Eleanor had written of loss, not the ordinary kind, but the kind that unravels the mind. 5 children, all taken before their 13th year, each death marked by the same signs, fever without heat, eyes clouding over with something glass-like, the faint echo of whispers before they drew their final breath. Grief turned to obsession, and obsession into ritual. The Blackwells, Eleanor wrote, refused to believe their lineage could end in death. "We will endure," one passage read, "for flesh is frail but the soul remembers its home." The family began hosting gatherings under the guise of mourning ceremonies, where the townsfolk believed they prayed for the departed. But in secret, they conducted rites meant to tether spirit to structure, binding their essence to the estate itself. Lydia traced her fingers over the ink-stained lines, the words *house as vessel* appearing again and again. The Blackwells had come to see their mansion as more than inheritance, it was sanctuary as trap. The rituals demanded reflection, hence the mirrors, each one serving as both a conduit and a prison. Eleanor's final journal spoke of the exchange, a rite performed to seal the family's souls within the estate, ensuring their continuity at the price of freedom. The phrase repeated over pages like an invocation, *We are of the house, and the house is of us*. It was then that Lydia began to notice new details around her, or perhaps old details that had waited for recognition. In the corridors, faint handprints appeared on the walls, like smudges left by children pressing against wet paint. The portraits shifted subtly when she passed, their eyes glinting faintly even in shadow. She began to sense that each Blackwell, long dead, lingered somewhere within these boundaries, not as ghosts wandering aimlessly, but as sentient fragments of the house itself. The idea horrified her, yet it also filled her with a strange pity. Whatever had driven them to such lengths had been born of desperation, a refusal to surrender to time's cruelty. Driven by equal parts dread and curiosity, Lydia continued to search for confirmation. She found it in the chapel at the rear of the estate, a structure nearly devoured by ivy, its stained glass windows fractured and dim. The altar was bare save for a marble basin filled with water so still it reflected her face perfectly, even in the darkness. Carved into the stone beneath it were words nearly eroded by time, *We trade what is fleeting for what endures*. She dipped her hand into the water, expecting cold, but the surface felt warm, almost pulsing. When she withdrew her fingers, the reflection lingered, her face still staring up from the basin even after she had stepped back. She found more symbols hidden in plain sight, a pattern of sigils etched along the molding, faint traces of ash inside the hearths, the scent of myrrh embedded deep into the floorboards. The house was a vessel, yes, but one that required constant renewal. The last of Eleanor's entries mentioned a final ritual, one performed not by the living but by those already bound. *The house remembers what it was promised*. It read. *It waits for the next to carry the name forward*. Lydia couldn't help but think of the carved headstones she had seen outside on her arrival, each bearing the same surnames repeated over generations. And at the very end of the row, one stone stood blank, the marble untouched except for faint etching that seemed to shimmer when caught by moonlight. By the time she returned to the main hall, the air in the house had grown heavier, and her reflection in the window looked paler than before, the eyes not quite her own. She began to feel the mansion's attention, a pressure behind her, a hum beneath her feet. Every creak of the floorboards followed her rhythm, every whisper seemed to shape her name differently each time. She recalled the line from Eleanor's journal, *The exchange cannot end with blood alone. It needs remembrance. It needs the willing. Lydia wondered, with a chill that rooted her in place, whether the family's disappearance from record had been an act of erasure or transformation. Perhaps they had not been forgotten at all. Perhaps they had succeeded in what they sought, the merging of soul and stone, the preservation of lineage through the walls that surrounded her. The thought sank deeper when she realized the fog outside had stopped its song. The silence was complete now, vast and waiting. She crossed to the nearest mirror in the hallway, not one from the chamber, but an ordinary one mounted above a cracked table. Her reflection stared back, lips parted, chest still. And then, almost imperceptibly, the image's mouth moved. It formed words she did not speak, words she could not hear but understood all the same. We are of the house, and now, so are you. The fog had not returned for 3 nights. The silence that replaced it was worse, a silence that clung to the air like residue, heavy and deliberate. Lydia moved through the Blackwell estate in a daze, no longer marking the passing of hours. She wrote less now, her notes scattered and incoherent, her once methodical handwriting reduced to frantic loops and half-formed words. Every mirror in the mansion had begun to react to her presence, faintly trembling when she passed. Reflection shifted by degrees, small inconsistencies that would vanish when she looked twice. A hand at the edge of the frame. A shadow behind her that wasn't there. A flicker of light where none existed. It was as though the house had begun to mirror not her body, but her thoughts, reflecting the unease gathering inside her, piece by piece, until she could no longer tell what was memory and what belonged to the mansion. She had considered leaving many times. Her car still waited in the overgrown drive, but each attempt to reach it dissolved into confusion. The path to the main road seemed to twist back on itself, no matter how many landmarks she used to orient her way. The forest around the estate, once dense and navigable, had become a labyrinth of repeating trees and false clearings. The more she tried to leave, the closer she found herself to the mansion's veranda. On the 3rd attempt, she returned to find the front door open wide, lanterns burning faintly inside, though she had extinguished them all before leaving. The house was patient. It never stopped her from going, it simply waited until she came back. By the 5th day, the strange phenomena grew more intimate. The smell of myrrh returned, faint but constant, seeping from the cracks in the walls. She heard the voices again, not the distant, haunting chorus of the fog, but close, whispering in tones that resembled her own. They spoke from corners, from behind the wainscoting, from beneath the stairs. Sometimes they used her name, other times they murmured fragments of her own sentences back to her, as if the house was learning her voice. Her reflection began to lag again in every surface that caught it, not just the mirrors, but the glass of the window, the silver of a spoon, even the basin water in the chapel. Each image moved a fraction too slow, and then, worse, it began to anticipate her movements before she made them. Sleep, when it came, brought no rest. She dreamed of corridors folding endlessly into each other, of faces pressed against glass, of children's laughter echoing through the fog outside. She would wake to find her journal open to pages she didn't remember writing, filled with phrases in handwriting that wasn't hers. Most were indecipherable, but one line appeared again and again in stark, deliberate strokes, the house knows when it is seen. Lydia began to understand that the estate was no longer merely haunted, it was alive, feeding on the presence of those who dared to remember it. It was on the final night that she went down to the family cemetery. She hadn't intended to. The impulse struck her suddenly, like a memory resurfacing rather than a choice being made. The fog had crept back in, denser than ever, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The path to the graveyard was lined with dead rosebushes, their thorns catching her skirt as she passed. The air smelled faintly of salt, though there was no sea for hundreds of miles. When she reached the iron gate, she found it already open. The grave stood in neat rows, the names of the Blackwell family carved into the stones with precision: Eleanor, Thomas, Samuel, Anora. Time had worn most of the inscriptions thin, but the dates were still visible. All of them had died between 1894 and 1896, within 2 years of each other. Yet there were more graves than names she recognized, and several stones bore markings instead of letters, strange looping symbols that matched those she'd found etched into the walls inside the house. As she walked further in, her lantern caught on something pale at the end of the row, the blank headstone she had seen before. This time, it was no longer empty. Words had been carved into the marble, the letters sharp and fresh, as though newly inscribed. Lydia moved closer, the lantern trembling in her hand. Her name was carved there in clean, deliberate strokes, Lydia Crane, 1894. Beneath it, smaller, an epitaph she could barely read through the haze of her breath, remembered by the house eternal. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The realization came in pieces, each colder than the last. The dates in the records, the supposed year the Blackwells disappeared, the last entry in Eleanor's journal, all pointed to 1894, the year history had claimed the estate fell silent. But Lydia was not from that time. Her arrival here, her study, her notes, they belonged to a century that had passed beyond the world carved into this stone. The house had been waiting since that year, and now it had remembered her. Her mind fractured around the impossibility of it, but somewhere deep inside, she understood. The Blackwells had not simply trapped their souls in the mansion, they had trapped time itself. Every person who entered carried their presence forward, perpetuating the family's memory so the house would never fade. Each generation drew in the next, each historian, each wanderer who came seeking truth, absorbed by the same relentless history. Lydia was not the first to arrive, nor would she be the last, but she was the one chosen to bear the family's continuation. The fog thickened until she could no longer see the gates. The air vibrated faintly, the hum she had come to recognize as the house's breath rising from the soil itself. Behind her, the mansion loomed like a shadow with veins of gold flickering faintly in its windows, pulsing like a heartbeat. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, as if hollow, and when she looked down again, she thought she saw faint movement beneath the surface, roots, perhaps, or something else. She heard the faint echo of a voice, not outside this time but within her skull, calm and familiar. It was her own voice, but older, slower, speaking words she did not form aloud. The house remembers what it was promised. Her lantern dimmed to a faint ember. The last thing she saw before the light died entirely was her own reflection on the surface of the grave, her face pale, her expression strangely calm, and behind her, in the mirrored sheen of the marble, a crowd of silhouettes standing shoulder to shoulder, watching in silence. When she turned, the graveyard was empty, the fog still and unmoving. The names on the stone shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and though she could no longer see her breath, she felt warmth on her neck, like the slow exhale of someone standing just behind her. The silence deepened, the kind of silence that isn't absence but occupation, and somewhere in the distance, the house let out a low, satisfied sigh.